Happy morning, dear students, and I am happy to welcome you all to today's botany class. So what are we going to study today? The continuation of chapter 2, which we started in our previous class, and today's topic will be about pollination. So we started chapter 2 the previous class, right? What did we study in our previous class? We had studied about the structure of flowers, right? So in today's class we learned the topic called as pollination. So before learning in detail about pollination, let us learn to define pollination. How can you define the term pollination? Pollination is defined as the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma among the same species. So do you remember the structure of a flower which we had studied in our previous class? We had studied all these terms, right? Pollen grains, anther, stigma and species. So when we draw a flower, so where is the stigma? The stigma structure is like this. The female reproductive organ is like this, right? So this is called the stigma. And where can you find the anther? You can find anther on both the sides, right? Do you remember filament and anther? The tube-like structure is called filament and the two particles here is called the anther, right? So this is the anther. So this is stigma and this is anther, and the pollen grains are present in the anther. Okay. So in the definition, the transfer of pollen grains, I told you where is the pollen grains? It is in the anther. The transfer of pollen grains from the anther. Why from the anther? Because pollen grains are present in the anther. The transfer, it is going to be transferred somewhere else from the anther. Where it is going to be transferred? To the stigma. Where is the stigma? It is here, right? To the stigma among the same species. What does this mean? Species means if rose plant is a species, the pollen grains from one rose plant has to be transferred to another rose plant. Okay. So if it is going to be hibiscus, it should be from the same hibiscus flower to hibiscus flower. Rose and hibiscus cannot be transferred. Okay. So same plant is called the same species. It is not same plant, same type of plant. If it is going to be hibiscus, pollen should be transferred to the stigma of hibiscus only, not to some other plant. Okay, that is what is meant as same species. So what is the definition? Transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma among the same species. Next we learn about the types of pollination. There are two types of pollination. One is called as self-pollination. The next one is called as cross-pollination. So pollination, you already know. Pollination itself means transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. Whatever type of pollination, every pollination this happens, that is transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. This is common in whatever type of pollination it is. Then based on what do we categorize as self-pollination and cross-pollination? See, if there is a flower, first I will explain about self-pollination. If there is a flower, so where is the stigma here? So this is the stigma, right? And there is the pollen grains. This part will have pollen grains because this is the anther. No. So what is given? If pollination happens in the same plant, it is called as self-pollination. So already I told you, whatever the type of pollination is, in every case there is transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. In self-pollination, it happens within the same plant. What does it mean? So the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of this plant to the stigma of the same plant. Within the same flower, it is going to happen. It is not the same plant, it is the same flower. So transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower is called as self-pollination. It happens in the same flower itself. Okay, this is self-pollination. Example is tea flower. In the flower of pea plant, you can see this type of pollination. What is cross pollination then? If the same thing, that is, see, this is flower number 1, this is flower number 2, this is some other flower, okay. So here you again have stigma here and you have pollen grains here, right. So this is flower number 1, this is flower number 2. Suppose instead of being transferred like this, suppose if this is not going to happen, okay. So instead of this, if the pollen grains from this flower is going to be transferred to the stigma of flower number 2. I told you this is flower number 1 and this is flower number 2. Instead of getting transferred within the same flower, if it is going to be transferred to flower number 2 or flower number n, to whatever flower it transfers apart from its own flower, it is called as cross pollination. So what is it? The transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of some other flower, then it is called as cross pollination. Okay, can you understand the difference? So if the transfer is within the same flower, it is self pollination. If it is to be to another flower, it is called as cross pollination. So these are the two types of pollination based on the transfer of pollen grains to the stigma. Then there are three kinds of pollination. Now let us learn about the agents of pollination. What is it? Agents of pollination. Who is the agent? Why a agent is required here? I was continuously talking that pollination is transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma, right. For this transfer, how it cannot be transferred like a magic, right. It should need some source to be transferred. They are called as agents. What are those three agents? The three agents of pollination are water, wind or animals. The three agents which help in the pollination process are water, wind and animals. Okay, so what does this mean? Here pollination happens within water. In water also you have plants, right? There are many plants inside the water also, and for that also pollination is possible. Okay, so inside the water itself, the pollen grains from one flower will be transferred to the stigma of another flower inside the water. For this, water will be the agent. Okay, and sometimes what happens, this have you seen, you must have seen this commonly, right? Just it will be flying in the air, these type of particles. Okay, so this is one type of pollen grain. Okay, lightweight material, it is light weighted pollen grain. Okay, so sometimes this type of lightweight pollen grains all are carried away by the wind. If there is a flower, the pollen grains are carried by the wind and it is transferred to some other stigma far away. Wherever the wind reaches, it can be transferred. For this type of pollination, which is the agent here? Which one is helping this process of this kind of pollination? The wind helps. So if this is going to happen, that type of pollination is called as wind pollination. And in some cases, have you seen, there are butterflies or bees on the flower. For what do they come? They come for nectar, right? They collect the nectar and make honey. Honey bees all collect nectar, that is the sweet liquid from the flower, and make it into a honey, right? For that they come to a flower. But when they come, what is happening? Without their knowledge, see, if there are pollen grains, these dots all, can you see? These dots are pollen grains. Okay, so when the bees or insects or other animals come near a flower or sit on a flower, the pollen grains without their knowledge stick on them. Okay, so after consuming the nectar, when they sit on another flower, no, these pollen grains will be transferred to the stigma of another flower. So in this way, unknowingly, the animal, that is the bee or the insect, they act as a agent of pollination. So in this case, which one is the agent of pollination? Animals are the agents of pollination. So now you know that there are three agents of pollination, namely water, wind and animals, right? Now in the upcoming slides, you are going to learn a little more detail about how these three agents are going to help in pollination process and what are the essential characteristics has to be present in a flower or a pollen grain if this has to happen. That we will be learning in the upcoming slides. Okay. So first we learn about pollination by animals. Can you see here? There is a honeybee here and there is a butterfly here. They are on the flower. Both of them have the habit of collecting nectar, the sweet liquid present in the flower. So what are they doing? They are collecting the nectar from a flower, but unknowingly they are involved in pollination process. See, not only honeybee and butterfly, even many more animals are involved, like birds, insects, butterflies, animals and bee. Okay, why do I call all these as animals? Because you have studied in your kingdom classification too, right? About animal classification you have studied. All of them come under the kingdom called as animals. That's why I call them as animals. Even man is an animal, right? So these are all involved in pollination process. Even some animals you must have seen, if they happen to touch a flower, if their bag touches a flower, and if they are going to another plant and that flower pollen grains which are sticking on the surface of the animal can be transferred to another plant. That way also animals can also, even bigger animals can also help in pollination. Okay, there are some characteristics which is present when animal pollination happens. What are those characteristics? Usually the flowers which transfer their pollen grain by animal pollination have a special characteristic. Their flowers are large in size and showy. What is this showy? Showy means it is beautiful or it is a center of attraction. You call some shows all as flower show or talk show. Why you use this word show? Because it is something which which will be noted by many. It is so attractive, right? So it is this type of flowers are generally, see, if you see, there are many flowers which are which are not so colorful or attractive, right? But some are brightly colored, and these insects or bees, they have the property to go and collect their nectar only from brightly colored flowers and flowers which are very big in size. That is the property of bees or butterflies. Everywhere, wherever you can find beautifully colored flowers, only these two will be attracted. It gets attracted by the color and also it gets attracted by the scent. What is scent? Scent means the sweet smell. Some flowers have a sweet smell, right? Can you give some examples? Rose has a very sweet smell, right? So scented flowers, whichever flowers have a good smell, they are called as scented flowers. So the sweet scent of the flower will attract the butterflies or the honey bees. So usually in these flowers only animals will pollinate. The colorless flowers all, they don't go near at all. Okay, so examples. Okay, and one more thing, they stick to the insect. Which one stick? Actually the pollen grains. I have forgot to include the word pollen grain. The pollen grains stick to the insects. So when they sit on the flower for the nectar, unknowingly these small round particles will stick on the surface and it will be transferred to the next flower when these animals go in search of nectar to the next flower. That is how pollen grains are transferred. What did I tell you? These insects or animals are generally attracted to brightly colored, large or showy flowers, and those which have a sweet smell, they get attracted and they go and sit on the flower. that time the pollen grains accidentally they stick on their body, and then when the insect goes to another flower, without their knowledge itself, the pollen grains will be transferred to the stigma of the second flower. Okay. So, where this happens, two examples are given. In sunflower, sunflower is colored, right, brightly colored, just dark yellow in color, and also hibiscus, which is usually dark red in color, right. So, in these flowers all animal pollination is very common. So, that is about pollination by animals. Next we learn about pollination by wind. See, have you seen this type of pollen grains from some flowers? You can see this will be just flying in the air, right. Many used to play with this type of pollen grains. Usually these type of flowers, if you see, there are many in number, they are large in number, which means one flower itself will have n number of pollen grains. See this flower, if you see, the pollen grains are many in number, you cannot even count that many number you will have. Those flowers which can undergo wind pollination will have many number of pollen grains. Large number of pollen grains are present in the flowers which have this character of getting pollinated by the wind. Then these flowers, if you see, they are not colorful at all. Does this have any color? No, it is colorless or white in color, right. So, usually they do not have any color, and it is not showy, which means it is not something which is so attractive, just it will be flying on the air, that is why it draws our attention, right. So, if it is present on the flower, usually it is not noticed at all because of the lack of color all. So, it is not showy, and also it is not colorful. These types of flowers which undergo wind pollination are not colorful, and then they are lightweight pollen grains. These pollen grains nature is so light, so that they fly in the air, whereas in shoe flower all, no, in hibiscus flower, if you see the pollen grains, can they fly in the air? Have you seen yellow particles flying in the air? They never fly because it is quite heavy, that they do not fly. But in the case of light weight pollen grains such as in this plant all, easily they will fly away, and through the wind only they are carried to another place, and they if they happen to sit on the stigma of some other flower, then pollination can happen. Otherwise, sometimes most of them are wasted. Though large in number, in this type of pollination, most of the pollen grains are wasted, because we cannot expect that it correctly goes and sits on the stigma of another flower. No, if that is happening, then there will be pollination. Otherwise, there is no pollination in this type of flowers. And then there is no sweet smell. Have you tried smelling this? I have all tried. There will be no smell in these kinds of flowers. And then they can reach to a place where the stigma is sticky or feathery. Usually such type of pollen grains are attracted wherever the stigma is sticky in nature, and there is no nectar in these type of flowers. What is nectar? Nectar is the sweet liquid like material which is present usually in a flower. There is no nectar, it is usually dry. Have you seen? Is it wet? It is not wet at all, it does not have moisture at all, it is very dry in nature usually. So, this is about pollination by wind. Next we learn about pollination by water, how water acts as a agent, or how it supports if the pollination is going to happen. The last agent which acts as pollinating agent is water. See, in water, under the water you have many plants. They are called as aquatic plants. What are they called as? They are called as aquatic plants. The plants which can live in water are called as aquatic plants. So, the plants which can live in water are called as aquatic plants. So, the example for aquatic plant is Vallisneria. Can you see? Vallisneria. In Vallisneria plant you have a unique property. You have male plant and female plant. Even in papaya, no, the papaya tree what you have is of two types, like they can be a male papaya plant or a female papaya plant, but in all the plants you cannot find this gender differentiation, but in some plants you can find. See, in this case also these are female plants and this is a male plant. Okay, so inside the water you have the bottom surface of the water will have soil, no, so there the plants will grow and they can be, I told you the name of the plant is Vallisneria. Vallisneria can be a female Vallisneria plant or a male Vallisneria plant. Here also what is happening? Pollination is happening, and which helps in pollination? Water helps in pollination. What is pollination? The transfer of pollen grains from the anther of the male plant to the stigma of the female flower, right? So here I told you this is a male plant and this is a female plant. So these pollen grains, can you see round particles here? These pollen grains are carried away by the water current. When water flows, no, so the flow of water will make them reach to the female flower's stigma. Okay, and then pollination can happen. So this is the way by which water can act as a pollinating agent. So what is the explanation part given? Just we will see quickly. So I told you already, these are all called aquatic plants because they live in water. The flowers are usually very small and they are non-showy. See the size of the flower when compared to the other flowers. This is given as a big structure, big diagram, so it is a little big. Usually these are very tiny flowers only. They are very small in size and non-showy. Is it colorful or is it attractive? No, right? So it is not showy in nature. And also they are very lightweight particles so that they can float in the water easily. Okay. The pollen grains are very light in weight. They float on the water. If something is very light only, they can float on the water so that they can reach the female flower. And then the example I told you, this plant is called Vallisneria plant, where you can have male flowers and female flowers. And also one more special property they have, the pollen grains. This pollen grains, no, they are covered with waxy layer. There is a coating like structure which is wax like substance so that it is protected. So this waxy layer's function is to protect the pollen grains from any external damage. So it is not damaged though it is carried away by the water. This is about the pollination in water. Water as a pollinating agent. So for your homework today you are going to read pages 26 to 27. When I tell read, just don't read in a hurry-burry. Take your own time, get all the words in your mind and memorize all the technical terms and read thoroughly. Next time you should not read again. That way you have to read thoroughly. Okay, so that is all for today's class, and until I meet you in your next class, you all take care and bye bye.